I'm Ruchika Mogha, CPA and Solution Engineer at Nakisa. I'm excited to walk you through one of the most impactful enhancements in Nakisa Lease Accounting Suite, which was released in 2025 R1. It's Consolidated Import Files. So that's the topic we're going to cover today. Whether you are onboarding new contracts, migrating data, or just looking to streamline your day-to-day workflows, today's session is all about making importing smarter, faster, and easier. We are going to explore what's new, why it matters, and how you can take advantage of this feature, especially if you're managing high-volume leases, data across multiple entities. So I'll share with you pro tips as well as best practices to help you avoid common pitfalls and maximize efficiency. As always, feel free to drop your questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself, ask the question during the demo, or we'll have some time at the end Q&A session where you can ask your questions. I'm happy to also address any real world scenario that you're dealing with on your day-to-day basis using the import files to create contracts. So what is a consolidated import file? To import multiple master agreements, contracts, lease component, activation group, units, charges, contracts, all at the same time. So now we have the capability of using one Excel file to import data for our leases at one shot. Now, why do we want to use the import files? So to avoid manual input, when multiple contracts must be created at the same time, user can create them at the same time using our new import files, as just mentioned, from master agreement up until the units, instead of entering them on the UI one by one. So it saves time. It will also avoid errors and have control over the inputs. So we have some clients that are already using it. Basically, what happens is enables the centralization of data entry. That means when all the leases are being created using the mass import file, it allows the COE team to review and validate inputs in a single file before they get uploaded. So the data can be populated in this file and can be reviewed by the COE team, which will ensure greater control and accuracy, as well as reduce the risk of errors before they are entered in the system. So unlike the previous version, it has more efficiencies for the users. Why so? Because it was a pain point from the clients that they had to upload each template. For example, the master agreement, it had to be completed, the process. It would give them the IDs to be included in the next step, which is the contract upload. And same thing for the lease component. So now you have one file with all the multiple objects instead of running one file at a time and waiting for it to finish processing in order to run the next template. You can also use this file for your UAT testings. When you have your enablement period, you can streamline your test data creation, you can minimize your manual efforts, and you can have reduced input errors as mentioned previously, which will enable you to have a quicker validation of the system behaviors and workflow. There are several key considerations that you should keep in mind when using the file. I'll go through them in the next few slides. So you can only import objects that flow in the hierarchy if you're selecting multi objects, as it requires mask workflow drop between each object. So for example, what is allowed is that you can select multi-select master agreement, contract, lease component, AG, and unit because they flow through. You cannot select master agreement and activation group. So you can see that the flow is missing between that master agreement and the activation group. So the other examples that are given here is master agreement to contract or contract to lease component, or if they have no connection between the mask workflow, So in this last example that you see here, it's master agreement, charges, and contract. So the system will allow you to do select this or these three objects because they have no flow between the two objects to run the mass workflow job. Similarly, the example I've given here is that you cannot have contracts and activation group and units because it's missing the mass flow work job between the contracts and lease component that only will trigger activation group. The user must keep in mind when they are updating the Excel file and adding new rows that they should have the correct formatting when they are copying from a row above. Next is that you have to make sure that all the fields like display ID only have plain values, which means if you need to select between, if you need to copy paste Excel IDs to multiple sheets, then you can use a formula in order to facilitate the process of populating the information on the Excel, but make sure that you copy paste and values once you have finished populating the whole file. If not, the system will pick up the formula itself and not the result, means the final value that you want to display. It will not get picked up, which will lead to import issues. So you'll have probably failures. So before you run the import file job, the best way is to always start an import job, download the latest template, and this will ensure that you're using the most up-to-date version. You can also check the revision history. I'll show you on the Excel file, which is the first sheet, first tab on the file, which you can review and see what are the changes that were made, if there's any from the last update. So you have to fill in all the mandatory fields in the Excel sheet exactly as they're completed in the application interface, which basically means all the mandatory fields on the UI when you're creating a contract, master agreement, lease component, those fields are the same that must be completed on the Excel file as well. And all the, it's done on the UI, all the values that you enter are per unit. Next is that import job sheets for accounting activation group and the units. I'll show you this on the Excel file as well. They have the only option that you can have is update entries. When you're creating the when you're creating the consolidated file, there are different tabs for master agreement, contracts, lease component, AGs, and units. In this, what I'm explaining is that when you are completing or populating the data on the AG and units, the first column, it's called Excel ID, it's called create operation, means are you creating, are you updating, or are you exporting? In this case, these two sheets or these two objects will always have to be update entries, except when on the contract accounting page of the AG and the unit cost center allocation. So I'll show them the UI. So this enhancement is small in the UI itself. It talks about how it has changed from import type to import. You also have no abbreviations, and the import sheets are grouped by the object type, as well as you have color coding for the object sheets. So as you can see in this example I'm showing, this is a template which has all the objects on it. And we have different color codings. For master agreement, it's blue. For the contract, it's green. For lease component, it's pink. For AG, it's yellow. And then I think it's purple for the units. So this can help the user to identify which tab they are, or which sheet they are working on. Who can run their import job? So like any other task or job that is run on a solution, it is based on your profile. So based on our permissions and roles matrix, the import job as well as the mass workflow transition can be performed by the user who has both lease administrator role that will give the access to him or her to run the import job. And they will need the batch user role or the mask workflow role, which is the new role, to run the mask workflow job. So they must have both the roles in order for them to run or upload a consolidated import file. If anybody has a question, please feel free to pause me or drop in the chat your questions. Questions so far? I'll take that as a no. So how to run an import job? So let's see. So first, the user will select single select or multi-select import objects. In the example on the right, we can see we have selected multiple objects, so master agreement, contract, lease component, AG, and unit. And as I mentioned, it has to be a logical parent-child structure in order for it to run the mask workflow job. Then the user will select the principal position, lessee or lessor, and then they have to select the ERP system. Some clients have multiple ERP systems, and this will help identify which ERP system needs to be impacted. Next, as I mentioned, it's always best to you'll select your different sheets that needs to be selected, and then you will be able to download the file. So the system will give you an export file whereby you will be able to populate the information that you have to enter in the Excel file, and you'll be able to upload the file for processing. The next step will be the system will validate and process the objects in sequence. So we'll go through the next steps. As I was mentioning before, when you're populating the data in the import files, just keep in mind that you have this pop-up that's available as a note, which will remind you that at the master agreement, contract, and LC, you have the option of creating new entities. And under the AG and units, there will be a notification for you to follow as well to remind you that you cannot create these entities. You can only update them. Just want to come back. If it's going to be exported, it's ignored in all the cases. So when the user is, I'm just going to go back on this one. When the user is going to click on, once the file is added and the user will import the file, what really happens is that on each of this icon, I'm going to skip the page and slide and show you here. Well, basically, it's notifying you or giving you the information that each object, that is master agreement, contract, and lease component, the mask workflow job will transition all the successfully imported entities into the active state. So triggering the clicking on the import icon is not only just running the consolidated upload file to create the entities, to create the objects, but also it's going to run simultaneously in the background a mask workflow job. And I'll show you an example of that as well. And that is going to change the status of the master agreement from defined to active. And similarly for contract, it's going to do the same, and same for the lease component. So this is automatically done. The next will be our activation group. So for the activation group, if selected, a mass workload job will transition all the successfully imported entities to the desired final state. This is optional for the activation group. If the user doesn't want it, you can leave it empty. And you can also decide to have a final state. That being said, means you can have either an active status, you can have a pending assessment, pending classification. It's the user's choice how they want to run their workflow or how do they want to validate the information. And if they are satisfied, they can run all the way to the active status. So what is happening in the backend, as I was mentioning, is the creation of automatically the mask workflow job. I'm just showing you one of the jobs which is running, which is basically the activation group. An example for this object is if you select active, what is happening in the backend. So what happens? So the user has selected activation group and had selected active status. So before it jumps from defined to active, in the latest release, we have introduced the split between the different stages or different steps from the time the state is activation at define to active. So what happens is first the system will run to send to assessment. It will then go to pending, and then it will get approved. So each step is being running in the backend. That's how the mass workflow transition also works for the remaining objects that we had seen before, which is the master agreement, the contract, and the lease component. Populating data in the workbook or the sheets that we have. I can show an example of the UI itself. Before I like to mention if you're selecting all the objects, as I mentioned before, there are 23 sheets that need to be completed. So there are quite a few sheets. So we want to make sure that information entered is accurate and we don't have any errors once we import it. The first one I want to cover is Excel ID. So we have to ensure that the Excel ID is consistently used between the objects to link the entries across the various sheets. So if you have a master agreement creation, the Excel ID for master agreement needs to be linked to a contract. And same, that is Excel ID for contract needs to be linked to a lease component. So I will show this on the Excel. And one thing I like to mention is the Excel IDs are not the assigned display IDs. Once your contracts or the objects are imported, they are just there for information purpose unless you have the migration mode on, which is back on the back end, it is set to true. What it does is that users or clients, when they want to have manual ID assignments, manual IDs assigned to their contracts, then in that case, the Excel ID will be same as the assigned ID that the clients have given. So I have clients who are actually using, as I mentioned before, the Center of Excellence, and they only create contracts using the upload template. So what happens is they will set the manual ID assignment to true on the FOSS, and they will be able to have manual IDs, which will be the Excel IDs. Any questions on that? Okay, I'll take that as a no. Again, now before we hop into the Excel file, just want to remind that you have to refer to your FOSS configuration settings, whereby you can get the data that we will be populating on the Excel. Keep in mind, if a sheet is populated with data, then you have to make sure that all the red headers will be mandatory to be completed. And if you're not populating data in a sheet, even though you have red headers in a sheet, you don't have to complete them. They become non-mandatory columns, just like the non-colored, non-red header columns. Go ahead, Brish, please ask a question.
Yeah, I think the question is, I think the user can also, in the future, let's say, they want to do some additional import of some data, right? So they can also export this contract, add something and re-import again, right?
Yes, I will cover that later.
Yeah.
So would you like me to answer now? I can cover it later.
No, later is fine. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. So let's look at the Excel file. Bear with me. So I have two Excel files that I have created. Okay. So when the user will download a file, So the first thing we'll start is looking at the revision history. As I mentioned, the first sheet or tab will tell the user what is the latest version or what is the latest update or the changes that were made on this template. As I mentioned not too long ago, that the columns which have headers in red, they must be completed, but they are not mandatory if you're not completing the sheet. So if you're completing the sheet, then those headers become mandatory. So I'll give you an example. So and others are optional. So let's go on the first page, on the first sheet. I can go through each column, might take a while. I'll skip a few, um, and we'll see what is mandatory and not mandatory. So in this example, we see here again, as I mentioned before, one of the slides, that the operation is giving you, on the operation, you have a note which tells you you want to create this entity, update, or export. So this is pretty much going to be on every sheet that you will see that is used in the consolidated import file. Next is the Excel ID. So this is required. This is basically a unique identifier for the solution to see, okay, this is a row which has this ID which needs to be linked to the master agreement definition page. Right, so this, as I mentioned, I just want to show the link between all the files before I go hop on to the next topic, is this Excel ID will be used in linking that ID to the contract definition tab. So when you're linking the master agreement to the contract, you have to enter the master Excel ID, which is, if you're creating a brand new contract, you have to ensure they are the same and they are unique. And if it's not the case, then you will be using the assign display ID, which is on the UI. So as it states here, it says when creating a contract under new master agreement, you must use the master agreement Excel ID as reference. If not, you're updating a contract, then you have to use an existing master agreement or the display ID on the UI. No questions on that? Okay, so let's go back, and just the way we have on the UI that your main required information on the master agreement is the Excel ID, the year, and the master agreement name, the lease area, display ID. These are the two required information for creation of the master agreement. Next is partners. As you can see, this is empty. This is an example of what I was saying. Even though you have red headers, you don't need to complete this if you're not entering anything. So if it remains blank, means it is not required to complete the red headers as well. Same thing for master agreement partners contracts. We have left it empty, so it's not necessary to complete it. So we have completed the section for master agreement. The next is contract. In this case, we have created just one contract. We are not creating more. And then we have the master agreement Excel ID that was linked, the contract name. This will be displayed on the UI. The external reference name and the internal, these are all optional. You may or may not complete it as required by your company policy. What we've included now also is to make it easier for user to create these templates or populate these templates. You have, for a lot of the columns, you will have a drop-down menu where it's easier for the users to just select one of the options from the drop-down menu. So in the previous versions, in our legacy version as well, the user had to actually manually input 01 or 02, like digits, which they had to go back and refer to see what each and every field. Sometimes it's time consuming. So now we have included, as I have just highlighted in green, when you will export a template, that's not highlighted in green, but this is just to show you that you have the option of the drop-down menu to select a type of the lease. Similarly, you have other fields which have drop-down menus. So I'm just going to go back to the amendment date. In the amendment date, basically, this will be auto-populated when the contract eventually will have some modification. Contract currency and principal position. So now in this tab, you can see we have to complete all the event headers. If the contract, this contract has considered as index currency, then we will select true or false. Same thing for asset value currency type. Then we have form lease. These are all optional. You don't need to complete. Definitely, we have to complete the lease area, which is lease area may have multiple business units, and business unit can have multiple companies. So all this is in your setting. So as I mentioned, when you're creating a contract, the user must know which company is assigned to which lease area, and the other going forward as well. So if a profit center is assigned to the company code, they must know it in order to populate this file. Otherwise, there will be errors, right? So either the user have access to an Excel file, which has all the data on it, or access to the FOS, which is the financial org structure manager page in the legacy version. So the remaining columns are not mandatory. If you have a business policy, you may enter it as required. The next one is lease determination. Actually, I just completed this section right now with you. If this is left empty, then the user must complete the lease determination tab. And if if you have selected here a lease type, you do not have to complete this section. So basically, this is answering the question in terms of who has the ownership of or the direct access to the asset as the asset being identified, service contract or not, who has economic benefit. So the other question basically, which determines what type of lease it is, which we had just seen not too long ago. In the drop-down menu, based on the questions we answered, it will select one automatically. Next we have is the accounting tab. And in the accounting tab, we will complete these sections for the contract sell ID coming from the contract lease definition page. Next, you can determine if you have a contract rate or you're using an IBR rate. So if you are using a contract, you'll put in the amount here or for the contract. If not, you will select true from the drop-down menu. If you have embedded derivatives or provisioning, you can say true or false, not required to answer it since it's not read. Next is the compounding frequency for the rate. In this case, we have selected monthly. Again, the user has the option on the drop-down menu. Next is a calendar type, which is required. Field, it will be regular, 360 or fiscal. The option is available for the user to enter from the drop-down list. Profit center and cost center, you can assign it here as well. And the remaining tab fields are optional. If the user wants to include a generate vendor invoice, they must answer true here on the column U. And if you have sales taxes, then you must say true or false. This is not mandatory. You can leave it as if you don't have. As well as the transaction type posting, tax calculation type. So this is for the contract accounting tab. Next is the cost center allocations. As I mentioned before, the user must know which cost center is assigned or which cost center from the multiple cost centers, which one is assigned to the company code and which one they would like to use. They must know this information via FOSS or the Excel file, and they can populate the data accordingly. Partners is required at this point to be entered. So normally partners is 40. So here we do have digit 40, but I think it's very standard and generic. But then, as I mentioned, some things needs to be traced back to the FOSS. In this case, we're using a partner display ID, which is we have selected V1500. So if I may just take a split second and look for um, one of the files that I have. Bear with me.
Yes, we can.
Sorry, the question.
No, it's all clear at the moment. Thank
Okay,
you.
won't be long. So as I was mentioning, we have this. We have these slides as well, which can be shared, where you can see the details provided to the users. And I just want to skip through and go on the contract and show you the partner IDs. So you can see here, this is a snippet from the FOSS, where you can see that the partner ID is used, and that must be input in the column D, which is the partner display ID. So I just want to show you that the user can go on FOSS and find this information, or it can be explored in Excel. Okay. The next is partner contacts. It is not a mandatory field. You can skip it. And same thing for the notifications. So we have completed the master agreement and the contract. Next, I'm jumping on to the pinks, which is the lease component. And we can see that we only have one contract that is linked, and the required is linked to our contract Excel ID, which we did in the green tabs, and we assign a lease component name. Salvage value should be technically a required field on the UI. It should be the same thing here. And I believe so. That's why we have left it at 0. Same thing for fair market value. Internal asset class is a required field. If it's a short-term low value service contract, this will not be a required field. Unit of distribution display ID, it's each. And this is also different as compared to our legacy contracts, where we were putting the RU start and end date on terms. It's on the lease component definition tab. So user must input this information. If the user aware of the GRV value, which is the guaranteed residual value, it can be entered here. Unit distribution, a lease component, we can assign one. In this case, I have one lease component, has one AG, and I've assigned 550 units. You can have multiple AGs under the lease component, and you can also have an activation group display ID included with the unit display ID in case you are using a migration on. If you use migration on, you can input this data. Let's see what it says on the note. That's exactly what it says. It says used only when migration mode is on with manual IDs generation type. So it will be when you're migrating data from maybe a new client is coming or a new acquisition of a company, you can use this migration on and input this information here so that it matches from your previous legacy solution. Next we have is the carryover balance. This is required if, as I mentioned, if you're migrating some leases. In that case, you need to complete this section. So if you have your two different sets of accounting standards, then you will have to import your company asset gross book value, and same thing for the secondary standard. You will have to enter the company current, the lease asset GBV, And same thing for the company accumulated depreciation. So the remaining are not necessary if you have to create a contract with a COB value, but we definitely need the GBV and the ADs. Is our uh, lease component terms and conditions. Again, this contract that we are creating has only one term in it. And if you have multiple terms, then you have to create multiple terms right here. So if you have different terms, then you make sure that you have changed the Excel IDs so that you can link it to the AGs as well. So this is linking to my lease component Excel ID, which is right here on the definition tab. Then I have the term type, which is again available in the drop-down menu. Then you have base rent. Technically, this should be also available in the drop-down menu. And then you have your amount frequency. The user has option to select day, month, one time, or year. Amount and the payment frequency. How often are we paying? The options are available to the user in the drop-down menu. First payment date and the last payment date is right here. The user must input this data. If the user would like to be notified about the expiry of this term, this lease, they can include the date here. It's not mandatory. Payment and calculation mode, one time in advance. Payment mode is given to us in the drop-down menu. So based on the term that you're using, you can have the payment mode as one time, or you can have it one time or daily. Next is these columns are optional. The user may or may not require to use it, depend on the lease that they have. If the first payment amount is different and if the date is different, then you have these two columns. If the last payment date and amount is different, they have these two columns. If they have provisioning, the columns that can be used is a Q and R. Month end, if it's the last day of the month, you can use this column and set it as true. In my case, it's the first of the month, and we're leaving it as payment timing, star of the day. Escalating rent, if you have an escalating rent scenario, then these columns must be completed for escalating rent. You can set it as true, escalating rent amount or percentage, and its type, which is fixed or percentage, as I mentioned. When, after how many periods will the escalation start? How often will it be done? And fast forward if you want to skip periods as well. So that's our lease terms and conditions on the LC. The vendor payment split, if it is required, you must complete these columns. I'm not going to go through them, keeping my time and constraints. Then we have the AG, which is linked to the terms are similar to what you have already entered in your lease component. And as I mentioned, each ID will be linked here if you have multiple terms. It will be linked, that will be lease terms and condition. It will be linked here. You have different terms that you need to bring it from your lease component. So just going back to your question, Paresh, quickly, if a contract, if the creation of AGs doesn't go active, for whatever reason it may be, the user will actually have to export the lease component. And in that case, it will have to be linked to the actual lease component ID. So right now you're seeing the generic ID when it was created, when all the objects are created simultaneously. So in this case, I'm using that lease component financial term Excel ID. But if the lease component has been created, but not the activation group, in that case, in order to continue the process of uploading after fixing the error on the activation group sheets, then the user will have to actually export LC, pick up the correct or the display ID on the exported file, include that here in order to move on to the next step.
Yes, perfect. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Um, the next is the accounting tab. So we can have different uh, rates in the accounting tab from the contract rate. So since the user has the option of modifying the contract rate, they have the option of changing it. Similarly, you have indexation now on the AG, the accounting tab, the activation group tab. If you have indexation, you can select between none, CPI, and global, and then you will be completing the respective tabs which apply. If you have indexation type, if you're selecting for lease, then you have to also select for the non-lease. If it's none, CPI, or global for non-lease type as well, indexation. The remaining tabs are not mandatory, so I will skip for this. Next is the classification, which is similar to the COB that we had for lease component. Therefore, I'll skip this as well. Next is terms, and I already explained that these terms are going to be similar. And basically, we are linking the terms with the lease component because the details of the terms are provided there. And we are basically selecting which lease component financial term XLID needs to be linked to this activation group. And we're defining if you want to exercise or not exercise. So if you want to exercise, you leave it at true. If not, leave it at false. Remaining sections are for indexation. It has been left at false, so we'll leave it as is. And the notifications, if the user wants to, a user needs to be notified, then you have to include the email addresses here. And keep in mind, you have to create for a new entity and update if you already have an activation group. The units, as you can see here, we have 550 units being created here, and they are all linked to the same activation group. So if I do a drop down, there's only one activation group. And if I click on XLID, we will have 550 XLIDs here. Cost center allocation can be changed as well when you're importing. It can be different from what you have on your previous objects. So you can actually change the cost center. This is a new feature that was released in 2025 R1. Any questions on the tabs before we hop on to the next, which is actually uploading a contract quickly on the UI? Anybody has a question? I'll take that as a no. And I will jump on the UI quickly. So basically, the user will have to come on the main menu. They will click on Import, Export Information. I'll quickly show you an example. Give me a second. Quickly show you an example of how to import. So if you just have to import one object, you can leave select one, or if you need to select multiple, you see you have to select the lease component is grayed out because you cannot jump through it. You have to always select the next subsequential object in order for it to run the master workflow transition. You can see the activation is grayed out. So we will be selecting like this. And I'm selecting lessee. ERP system must be selected. And you can see, as I was showing you in the slides before that, how this will be auto transitions to active status. And now the user has the option to activate the change the state of the activation group if you want it to be active, or another state that you want to leave it as. So quickly, if I go here and I would like to bring my contract, which I know should work, normally you would just click on import. Or if you want to do a download sample, the user will be coming here to template sample data will be toggled, and they can actually download a sample template. In my case, I've already done that, and I've shown you a contract that I have populated the fields, and now I'm importing it. So what you see on the right-hand side is basically creation of the objects, and while doing so, what happens is every object gets queued first, and then it will be through the mass workflow transition, it will automatically get approved. And once it's successful, then it'll run the next job. So looks like our job is already completed, and we can see that there are no errors. So all of the objects have been created. So if we click on it, it tells you it has been successfully created, as well as you have the option to either on the left-hand side to download the original import file, or just look at the import status, which is similar to what you see on the actions on the right, or you can actually download the import file itself. Any questions on a successful mass import consolidated file upload and creation of the activation group, LC contract, and master agreement? If there's no question, I'll move on. And I am skipping through this because we have covered all of this, showing you the different explanations. So now the results of the import job. Under the results of the import job, what can we see? So as we just saw, the first would be a successful creation of all the objects. In that case, you will see in the column done, everything will fall in the column done, as that will be the same as the total, as well as if you will click or download the file, it tells you which this assigned display ID is given to each object, which is same can be seen on the actions on the right column right here under the import task. Second could be a case where Paresh mentioned that if you have a failure, right? So you can see that if one object is failed, then the previous one will also subsequently fail. So we'll have to open the actions, download the report, and see what the errors are in order to move on to the next steps. So in this scenario, what will happen, as I mentioned, you'll have to check the import report, download the report file to view the errors, correct the errors. You may have to export the previous object, as mentioned, if required, and you will have to update on the next object which was failed, the Excel IDs if required, and you have to re-upload the import files. So this is an icon which basically says the job was completed, but there are some errors that you have to correct. Third is an example here showing you if there are some missing sheets in your Excel workbook, the error will pop up telling you failure missing sheets, and then you will not be able to proceed. So it's a validation even before you actually start the import job. Another example of error even before you start the import job is if there's a bad format. So if in one of the columns, as it states here, is that make sure the format is correct, or sometimes in an amount column you have a date or text. So the system will identify and give you an error before, even if you have imported the file. Next is the best practices. So as I said, users should use multi-select import for bulk onboarding. It's just faster and easier to create contracts. When you have large samples or large contracts to be huge number of contracts to be created, say 500, the user can or should try to use some sample contracts to see if they're using it for the first time, and they should try and do it on your pre-par, obviously, before they do in the production. Next is you should mostly try and use the drop-down menus to minimize errors. That's why I said initially that when you are creating, copying the files, make sure that you are not copying without the format. And users should also try to use mass workload transition for the batch approvals. So that will make things easier and faster. So it's a wrap today's session. So I've gone through the pain points the clients have faced in the previous versions, and we saw how the new feature can transform how you import and manage your lease data. With one file, one flow, and fewer errors, you now have the tool to tackle bulk onboarding and update your contracts with confidence. And as I mentioned, always download the latest template before you start the import.